You're listening to the Skylight Books podcast. We're an independent, general interest bookstore putting great reads in the hands of people in the Los Feliz neighborhood of Los Angeles. Hosted by resident Skylighters, we're here to bring you new and exciting author conversations, group reads, and bookseller chats. Happy listening. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for this event featuring Other Names for Love by Taymour Soomro, and he'll be in conversation with Jonathan Parks-Ramage. My name is Natalie. I'm the Assistant Events Manager at Skylight Books, and I'm going to introduce you to our guests, and then we will get started. Taymour Soomro is a British Pakistani writer. He studied law at Cambridge University and Stanford Law School. He has worked as a corporate solicitor in London and Milan, a lecturer at a university in Karachi, an agricultural estate manager in rural Sindh, and publicist for a luxury fashion brand in London. His short fiction has appeared in The New Yorker and the Southern Review. He has published a textbook on law with Oxford University Press and has written extensively for the Pakistani news media. And he is the co-editor with Deepan Anpara of a creative writing handbook on fiction, race, and culture. Jonathan Parks-Ramage is a Los Angeles-based novelist, screenwriter, and journalist. His critically acclaimed debut novel, Yes, Daddy, was named as one of the best queer books of 2021 by Entertainment Weekly, NBC News, The Advocate, Bustle, Lambda Literary, Goodreads, and more. Amazon Studios is currently adapting the book for television. His writing has been widely published in such outlets as Vice, Slate, Out Magazine, W Magazine, Lit Hub, Atlas Obscura, Elle, Electric Literature, and more. He is also an alumnus of the Bread Loaf Writers Conference. Thank you both so much for being here.
Thank you for having us. Oh, there she goes.
Yes. How wonderful to be here with you.
So I think, are you going to start off by reading?
I mean, I guess so. Okay, I'll read very, very briefly.
Full passage. We have to get a taste.
Okay, so I'll read from the beginning so that I don't have to explain anything. Other Names for Love. From his cabin, Fahad could hear his father shouting instructions at someone, his voice so near it was as though he were here beside him, and Fahad flinched away. The carriage jerked, a whistle sounded twice. Footsteps thudded down the passageway outside. The crowded platform slid past the window. Fahad set his case on the bed. He inspected his bathroom, sliding its door shut so he could turn around. It was narrow as a coffin with speckled tin walls, a shower hanging sideways on a hook, a rimless toilet. At the bottom of the toilet was an aperture through which the tracks flashed, faster now as the train sped up. The smell of mothballs prickled his eyes with tears, which he jabbed away with his fists. He wasn't angry anymore, he really wasn't. Through the closed doors, over the chug of the engine, the whistle squealing, he heard his father call his name, the syllables hard as drum beats. There was a small high window, and through it the lowering sun made a hot square of light on his face. His father's voice became louder and louder still. Now he must be in the cabin, Fahad thought, must have his hand raised to the latch of the bathroom door. But when Fahad slid the door open, the room was still empty. It was to punish him, that much was obvious. The train passed the low sandstone barracks of Karachi's cantonment, a giant cannon on a plinth angled towards him, a fighter plane painted in camouflage propped up mid-takeoff. Everything Fahad did, his father twisted his mouth at, that his clothes were too tight, his hair too long, that he sat with his knees too close together or his legs crossed the wrong way, that he spent too much time with his mother and his ayah, that he liked to cook and to set a table, that he was charming company to guests, that he was first in his class this year, that he could recite the charge of the Light Brigade from memory, that he acted in plays, that his voice was shrill. His father was a cannonball, an avalanche, something giant crashing through the jungle. That was what Fahad and his mother said of him in private, one of the little jokes they shared. And now Fahad was to spend the summer with him at the farm upcountry instead of in London. To stay in Karachi, even that would have been tolerable. Even Karachi seemed like civilization. The carriage wobbled, and he steadied himself against a little desk that folded out from the wall. They had reached parts of the city he didn't know, tall apartment blocks, one pale green, another purple, a third yellow, gaudy washing slung out over balconies to dry, rusting air conditioner casements. The train slowed as the track ascended. They were level now at the higher stories of these buildings. A woman unfurled a bright red sheet like a flag, her arms splayed. She frowned, it seemed, directly at him and shook her head.
Stunning. I
Thank
love
you.
hearing it in the dulcet tones of your beautiful voice.
Thank you.
Yes. No, seriously, such an evocative and literally propulsive opening. I guess I wanted to start by just asking you about what the genesis of this book was. What was kind of the first spark of inspiration for you? And then how did that evolve over time?
Sure. It's kind of like a couple of very disparate things. And one of them was that we have a farm in Pakistan, and I looked after that farm with my grandfather, and it was a really fascinating and challenging experience, and everything was so strange to me, and it did look like a giant barbarians and all of that. So it was, and then I realized that was so much of that was my own prejudice, and so it was this kind of journey of self-discovery for me, but also about like seeing a place and a people, like the way that I saw them was kind of transformed. But there was something completely separate which also inspired it, which was that I had an ex who I had a relationship with who, I mean, I slightly wonder if I should say this. No one will know who he is, so I'm sure it's all right. But anyway, I had an ex.
We want the gay tea.
So I had an ex, and he, when he was 16, had ended up in this sort of sexual encounter with like a Cub Scout leader. And it was a horrible encounter, and he had told his parents, and then nothing had really happened. Nothing had happened to the person. And then, when I knew him all those years later, that incident still, it still had this kind of resonance for him and this meaning for him. And he didn't really know how to think about it. And he didn't know how to think about, like, part of him felt sort of culpable in some way, even though he'd been a child. And actually that really interested me. Of course, it was such a horrible thing to go through, but it also interested me the way that those events can kind of change in your mind over time, and your role in them can change. And then also the way that parents might engage with something like that also interested me.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating. And I think that, I mean, obviously the characters in your book are different than what you're describing, but I do think, yes, you do kind of trace this one relationship, which is very formative in these early years. And then you kind of see that, how that reverberates over a lifetime. And that's also something I wanted to ask you about, because I do think that, this book has elements of kind of like the queer coming of age genre, but it also, I think, pushes against kind of the wistful and sentimental sepia toned tendencies that the genre can have. And I find that really refreshing, is the kind of resistance to sentimentality that the book has, especially in this central relationship. It's not Call Me by Your Name. It's something very different and unique, and it is, I think, as tender as it is violent in some respects. So I guess talk to me a little bit about, kind of the genre, if you were even thinking about it, if you were pushing against it, and kind of how you infuse the story with, again, both tenderness and violence.
Yeah, I think I was thinking about it in some ways, that I felt like there were these tropes about, like you said, these sort of sentimentalized kind of experiences. And then also the other trope that I felt like I saw was, a young queer person abandoning or having to reject their home or their past or the place they'd come from in order to kind of find sort of liberation and enlightenment in themselves. And often that was like a journey from somewhere rural to somewhere cosmopolitan, or from like somewhere like Pakistan to maybe somewhere like London or, England or America. And I wanted to kind of, and of course, for some people, for some stories, that's true, but it wasn't like a truth that was very personal to me, and I wanted to kind of push back against that a little, against that idea as the only possible, I think, story, just because I'd seen it so often. And then that about like tenderness and violence. I mean, I feel like it's so interesting, and in a way, it's why I feel like Yes, Daddy, to me, it's like a book which has like tenderness. It has these kind of tender moments, but it also has this kind of really dark, this darkness and violence to it. And I remember actually when we discussed it first before I'd read the book, and you described it to me, and I was like, oh my God, this sounds so glamorous. And you were like, no, this this is dark, and it is. And I think, and that felt so important to me in your book, and actually it felt really important to me in mine as well, to recognize the way that violence, is such a kind of integral part of male relationships. It's kind of the way that so many men are taught, like almost as though it's like a part of intimacy, as though violence is a part of male intimacy, So I feel like violence almost comes more instinctively, or we're told it's like natural. It's like a kind of a natural masculine imperative, so that it seems like that, and then it kind of weaves it almost dictates the way that relationships between men unfold. So it was important to me to engage with that. And then tenderness, because I think tenderness, in a way, it's like in the face of that, in the face of these kind of imperatives of violence, to still try to reach across and get closer and form a bond. Like, that's also what I was really interested in. How do we kind of cross that divide?
Yeah, I mean, there's this like pulsing in your book between violence, both physical and emotional, both, I mean, really in Fahad's relationship with everyone. I mean, there is kind of this like push and pull between tenderness, between violence. And I think what results is a real nuance. And it ties into what you're talking about. Like, there are no villains in the book. Do you know what I mean? And I think there are no villains in real life. I mean, my therapist said that once, and I was
right.
Like, well, maybe not. but I mean, I think
maybe not for you, but yeah.
I think her point was that there are human beings. Everyone is a human being. I mean, and if you are able to peel enough away, obviously people do horrific, unforgivable things. But that villain, the idea of a villain, is something that happens in a Marvel movie. So I do think you did a really good job with that, in terms of, also the depiction of his relationship with his father. It's not this one-dimensional, like, well, you move out of the country and move to a Western city and it's all better. Like, it's which is just like not true. It's like not real. Right. There's no nuance in that. So I also wanted to ask you, about kind of, in terms of queerness, there is, I mean, I don't want to give too much away for people who haven't read the book, but there is another queer-coded character. I don't know if he would identify as queer, probably not use that word, but, there is another kind of queer-coded character who's older than Fahad in this family context. And what it kind of allows you to do, I think, as an author, is explore the way that queerness has been dealt with within this family over the course of generations, and kind of over the years, what has changed, what hasn't, what's been repressed. There's also echoes of Fahad's character with this other character, in the way that, his father views him. So what was kind of your purpose in having this kind of intergenerational depiction of queerness within this? If it wasn't, I don't know.
I mean, I'm trying to sort of think of, how to I'm trying to think about how I thought about it. I think in some ways there was an idea that I liked a kind of mirroring, and what you were saying as well is a sort of like a pattern that repeats across time, so that it was important to me that queerness shouldn't seem like something purely contemporary or something that was kind of invented in the modern age, but also that there were all of these different ways of being queer, and and as you said, they're not, maybe that isn't even the language the characters would use. I think it isn't, but that there are ways for men to have relationships with men that can be very different, that can be intimate, and I think also in a way I wanted to provide, perhaps almost an opportunity. It's because so much of the book is about Fahad's relationship with his father. And so in a way that relationship is an opportunity for his father to sort of to do it again, to like do over and maybe do it differently than he did the first time round, and just an opportunity for kind of growth or for change, and to learn from the earlier relationship. And I think also maybe to some extent that I feel like, I don't know if this is the case with you, Jonathan, but I feel like there's sort of this kind of gay specter that sort of like haunts me. It's always like, it's like the curse of the gay that you might be or that you might become, like, don't become this gay. And I think in a way,
I do feel haunted by a similar specter.
I think like one of the books I read a lot when I was writing this was Death in Venice. And by Thomas Mann. I don't know if you remember that, but in that this character, this composer, who's very straight-laced and very conservative, goes on this trip to Venice, and on the boat across, he sees this man who horrifies him, and it's this like this man who's old but trying to look young and wearing makeup and a powdered wig and behaving in this flamboyant way, and to the main character, he's so grotesque, he kind of is disgusted by him. And then over the course of the novella, he sort of becomes that character. And so in a way, I mean, obviously something very different happens in my novel, but I like this idea of like, the kind of the model, a queer model that perhaps Fahad could model himself after or against.
Right. Well, I mean, it is that kind of dynamic definitely is present. I mean, he does kind of rebel against the idea. I think he does initially certainly see, the character as grotesque. It's something he doesn't want.
Right.
But then that perspective shifts over time. Yeah, it's one of the things that I absolutely loved about the book. I want to go back to something you said. You touched on it a little bit earlier. In terms of the farm and the fact that your family also has a farm and kind of the personal kernel there. I mean, I guess, tell me a little bit about your personal journey, kind of mining your personal experience for this book, and in describing the farm. Obviously it's not the same, and obviously this is fiction, but did you feel any sense of responsibility to the farm, to the people that work the land, to the whole region? I mean, did you feel any sort of responsibility to the place that you were describing as you were describing it?
I mean, I suppose I did feel a kind of responsibility, and in a way it was really important. It has been really important to me that Pakistani readers should read the novel, and connect with it, but also not see it as inauthentic. So that to see it, to kind of to recognize it, that somehow felt really important to me. And I think that I did feel a kind of burden, I suppose, because like stories about Muslims, stories about South Asia, the Middle East, they're so often stories about violence, about like barbarism, about misogyny, and I really didn't want to repeat that trope. I really wanted to, so it was, but at the same time there was, when the violence was was a part of the story. So it was really something that was critical for me to include. So it was kind of trying to work out, how do I do this without just repurposing these tropes. And I think actually something that was quite important to me was that this book should not be about religion. And I'd spoken to a screenwriter who was interested in adapting the novel, and he said, this should be about religion. Religion is where is like an obvious, it provides obvious conflict. But actually, it was really critical to me that the novel didn't, that was not the center of this novel. That it's which is not to say that it's not important in stories about anywhere, but about Pakistan too. But it wasn't central to this story. So yes, I felt some responsibility, I think. I mean, in some ways as well, I kind of felt a responsibility maybe to my own kind of nostalgia for the place, and to my own kind of memory of the place that I wanted. And like, looking back at the book, I mean, it sounds a bit absurd or strange, but it kind of like, I feel like that nostalgia when I look at the book and I look at its representation of the farm, because you know because there's a kind of truth in it for me as well, that the farm is sort of changing, and that my own relationship with it is sort of diminishing or becoming a bit more distant.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I mean, and there's also, what I love is, you don't, in terms of the farm, like, you don't shy away from the class dynamics as well, like in terms of, it's a very symbiotic relationship that exists between the owners and the land and the people who farm the land. So I also thought that the examination of caste again was subtle. You know what I mean? It's not throughout. I mean, you just do such a good job of nuance, but it's not just like big evil boss who oppresses workers. Like, I mean, I do think that you depict a nuance to the relationships. I talk a little bit about kind of your approach in this.
I mean, I think it's also going back to what you were saying before, which was that I didn't want to write a story with easy villains, just because I felt like it's not the way that I see the world. And even in this question of class, as you said, the farm belongs to my family, and when I go there, there are people who work on the farm, and there is this huge distance between us in terms of power, and this kind of power dynamic, which of course made me and makes me uncomfortable, because there's this extraordinary inequality, and it's really completely by chance that I was born into one position, and maybe the farmer who's tilling the land was born into another. And so knowing, when I went back to the farm, I kind of pushed back against that relationship very hard, because it felt very wrong to me. And then I struggled to know how to like manage the farm without those relationships, and so in the novel, I think those questions, because I feel like a central preoccupation for me in the novel was like a question of power as this kind of thing that men want, and it sort of shapes their desire to. And so class intersects with that for me, and in a way that there's this sort of relationship that Fahad has with the son of a neighbor, and there is a question of class there too. And it really interested me to think about how that might inform desire and desirability for both of them, how that might intersect with the way they kind of express their queerness to each other.
Yeah, and I love that layering. I mean, I think that, again, it's this nuance, and it is something that's just not simple. It's more than just rich mouse, poor mouse, or whatever the fable is.
Right.
There is so much more depth and nuance and intricacy that results because of class differences. another,
And I suppose,
yeah, go ahead.
no, I was just going to say as well that something that really interested me as well was this idea of a kind of a diminishment of power to sort of see a family or to see men who have, like Fahad's father Rafik at the beginning of the novel has a lot of power, and his power sort of increases into the as you get to the middle of the novel, and then it very drastically kind of tapers off. And that also really fascinated me, to think about men at these different points in their lives, where their power varies very greatly, and how that changes the way they kind of construct their own identities and changes the relationships they have.
Yeah, I mean, that's fascinating. I mean, again, not to give too much away, but there is also when there is that loss of power, it's kind of like if this man has for his whole life has viewed power as such an integral part of his identity, and when that goes away, all that he really has left is his family.
Right.
And so I did kind of like, I love just that kind of idea of kind of the trappings of your life, which at one point are so complex, become distilled down to kind of this essential unit, which can be estranged, which can be imperfect, and it's like, how do you deal with that, especially if you're facing the end of your life potentially.
Right.
And so, I mean, and that's another, I also wanted to touch on kind of like the father-son dynamic. There's at one point, Rafik says something like, all of us sons, but no fathers. And I felt like that line had like a lot of resonance throughout the book. For almost every male character, I think Fahad in particular is struggling with a father who's defined almost as much by his absence as he is by his presence. In fact, he almost prefers initially to be away from his father, to be with his mother in London. But yeah, I think also, Rafik has his own struggles with an absence of a father figure. So I guess what were you thinking about when you were, exploring, father-son dynamics in this book?
I mean, I think the novel really started, or rather the center of the novel was like a father-son relationship. And actually, the sort of the love story in it kind of came later. And it came partly because I had read this interview with Gary Steingart where he said, oh, every novel needs a love story. And I was like, oh my God, my novel doesn't have a love story. So I was like, let me just...
Nice. A good craft.
I think I was at that stage where I was like, I will literally take any lesson I can find and squish it into my story, which was what I did. But I mean, it felt like the novel needed that love story. But in a way, the bigger or the more important love story is the one between the father and son. And that I was really interested in mapping that across a long period of time. But I was also interested in the way that maybe for men who have relationships, romantic relationships with men, how like a father-son dynamic may be the only model for intimacy, or for a lack of intimacy, for something to like emulate or something to push back against that maybe men have or boys have. And in a way, I feel like it's like it's one of the several connections between your novel and mine too, because like this idea of a father figure, of different kinds of father figures, of what happens in that space between the father figure and the son, between fathers and sons, but also in a kind of a romantic relationship which sort of mirrors that, and where power ends up being such a kind of critical determinant. And yeah, I mean, I feel like it was one of the things I loved about your book. But like, I wondered as well with yours, like, just to turn the table for a moment, whether you intended to have this kind of mirror between a romantic relationship and a father-son relationship.
Oh yeah, I mean, yeah, we all have daddy issues, I think, is the bottom line.
Yes,
100%. I mean, I do think that is. If I don't want to generalize about gay men in particular. But I do think that there is, yes, that kind of a father-son dynamic can certainly have ramifications across a lifetime. I mean, I think that all parental relationships can obviously affect you and manifest in ways over a lifetime. But I think particularly for queer men, there is certainly, that dynamic of fathers and sons. I also wanted to talk to you about the shift to Rafik's perspective. So his father also in the book, it's weighted almost evenly in terms of how you do kind of close third with father and son. And I thought it was so beautiful because you do such wonderful work in terms of what they both see, but what they don't see. So there is, and then what the reader is kind of forced to question or fill in because of these gaps. So talk to me a little bit about that perspective shift, both from, I guess, a character perspective and a style perspective.
Sure. When I started writing, and actually for so many of the early drafts, there was no shift in perspective, and the novel was told entirely from Fahad, from the son's perspective. And I kept kind of getting stuck. Like I felt like it just didn't have a kind of a momentum or a force. And so then I just tried shifting perspectives just to see how that would feel, and it ended up kind of unlocking the novel for me. And then subsequently it made complete sense to me, because actually in a way, like, my central thesis was that or rather my aim was to kind of to show both sides, really, and to show what it felt like. I felt maybe like in the contemporary queer narrative, of course, the point of view, the queer point of view is what we're so used to, but I was kind of interested in seeing the other point of view. And also in Rafik is this sort of patriarch who kind of represents everything that his son sort of rebels against, but also wants to emulate. But I also wanted to kind of, I felt so much empathy for him, and I kind of really wanted to look inside his head and to see how difficult it was for him, how much he wanted to be close to his son, how much he wanted to love his son, and how difficult it was for him, how much he struggled with that. That was really, really important to me, to kind of show both of them sort of reaching outside of themselves towards each other, rather than just to show that from one direction.
Yeah, I mean, and it also lends such a beautiful texture to the book, again, to be able to inhabit the point of view of the father, someone who could come off as potentially one-dimensional. It does, again, add that layer of depth. And there's, oh my God, the heartbreaking scene where he shows up in London and just gets like an icy reception from his son. I mean, it's just, but to be inside, so you really, and the power dynamic there. I mean, that there is a desire on his part to really to try to understand his son. It's not just this in the sand of.
Yeah, and I kind of love this idea of missed opportunities, those moments where one person reaches towards the other and the other isn't reaching back, or the other reaches. I kind of loved the kind of heartbreak of that. So I really, that was also something I wanted to engage with.
Yes. I also wanted to ask you, the protagonist is obviously a writer, or becomes a writer, and so you always have to wonder. I kind of wanted to ask, there is this scene later in the book. He grows up, he's a writer, and he's in a writing workshop, and he is kind of in the workshop, he's reminded of the farm, and kind of this and kind of his growing up on the farm, and the fact that he hasn't written about the farm. And there's just one sentence I will read you. What if he wondered for a terrible moment? He'd written nothing in so long because he hadn't written this, because he's written always so far away from himself, as though tossing a grenade. And I just thought that was so fucking good and so brilliant in terms of how it describes writing something that is painfully personal. And obviously, I'm not asking you to go into the painful personal detail, even if there was one. But I am curious as to how, this is personal. So I am curious, did writing this affect you in any way? Did you feel like you interrogated things about yourself or learned things about yourself or were forced to confront things about yourself? Or do you just not want to divulge that and you can tell me to...
Never. I could never tell you that, Jonathan. But that sort of section really, it felt like such a kind of bearing of my soul to myself, because I had tried to write so many times before, and I had never tried to write, but I'd always tried to write really far away from myself, because I couldn't look at myself with such kind of, I was really afraid to look at myself so closely. And so with this novel, I tried to do that, and actually it was really an interrogation of myself and of my experience on the farm. And the farm just ended up being this very significant place to me, because it was this place, this kind of crucible in which, like, every idea I had about myself as a man, my masculinity, my power, who I was, all of that, all of my thoughts about myself as kind of cosmopolitan and worldly and educated and all of these things, all of that kind of came together. And I really was kind of forced to think about, how I constructed my own identity and, what kind of power I was claiming and where I was claiming it from, and all the ways in which I felt like I'd failed and that I'd failed as a man. I really thought that I experienced that so much when I was on the farm. And so then when I came to write this novel, those were the ideas that felt most alive for me and that I really wanted. And actually this was the big difference when I came to working on this novel versus what I'd written before. When I'd written before, it was always really like, yes, write something kind of light and write something entertaining and write far, far, far away from yourself for so many reasons. But with this, I thought about the things that interested me about myself, and that I kind of felt, I don't know if ready is the word to say, but Alex Chi in his book, How to Write an Autobiographical Novel, he talks about this imperative, like how, with his first book, he had to do it. And I kind of felt that when I came to, when I worked on this novel, I felt like I had to write about that place, that those experiences were full of these kind of truths about myself, and that it was sort of my kind of duty to myself to interrogate them. And yeah, so was it traumatic? Was it difficult? Yeah, it probably was, because I really felt like and the main character is close to me in that process of writing, and I don't know whether you've experienced this, but for me, I had to kind of write away. I had to sort of write and write and write so that he would become someone who was not me, but he started out as me. But I had to draw on so many of those experiences. There are these moments where he sort of is interested in this, the son of a neighbor, and his desire is so kind of frightening and horrific and grotesque to him. And how does he engage with that desire? And of course, those were feelings I'd felt. And to kind of write them, I kind of had to go back to that moment, which was, not a particularly wonderful moment, but it was really interesting. It was really interesting to kind of shine a light upon it.
Yeah, I mean, there's kind of like the aphorism about if it feels scary, it's probably good writing. Which probably is not always true.
No.
But Yeah, I
But
mean,
I feel like we kind of have to keep it interesting for ourselves at the very least. Do you know what I mean? Like if the process is not, if we're kind of not engaged in the process, like it's impossible to tell what a reader will think, but at least to kind of interest ourselves. You know what I
yes,
mean?
yes, and you have that that it does course with that kind of wonderful sense of urgency, I think. And I mean, it's interesting that you bring up Alex Chi, because your book, it didn't remind me of Edinburgh. I don't know if you've read his book Edinburgh,
I have, yeah.
but it sort of reminded me of Edinburgh in terms of the prose style. You guys obviously have different prose styles, but I think what you're both so skilled at is you have an incredible economy of language and a talent for crafting sentences that are very spare. There is not a single wasted word. And for that reason, I think they just kind of emanate with this beautiful poetry and this
Thank you.
beautiful resonance, which I envy because, honey, I love a verbose purple fucking sentence that I have to edit down later. So
You
this is
edited them all out. They're not in Yes Daddy. They were all edited out. If that's even true, Jonathan, I don't know if I believe it.
but this is partially a question for me, but like, how do you approach, I guess, this is more a craft question, but how do you approach, editing your sentences?
You know, the way that I kind of wrote the book was that I wrote these full, complete drafts, and then I would put them aside and then rewrite them from scratch in the belief that I would hold on to everything in the story that was important. And, because like I love like that purple prose too, and I love my beautiful sentences, and then I'll just hold on to them, and then I'll shape the entire chapter around this one sentence that I can't bear to lose. So the only way I found to deal with that was to put the entire draft aside and start with a blank page each time. But each time I would have a stronger sense of the story, and then I felt like that allowed me a kind of tightness in the story, and to kind of be driven by the sort of the energy of what was happening, as opposed to like for me, holding on to like sentences that I loved, which is absolutely what I would do.
Yeah, I mean, and then how, this kind of piggybacking on that in terms of craft, how what was your experience like? Because you come from writing short stories, and you've published many a gorgeous short story in a journal.
Like,
What was it like? I mean, what was different in terms of your approach to writing a short story versus a novel, which is obviously a different
yeah,
beast.
I really struggled to switch. And I remember I was writing the novel as part of a PhD, and I remember my supervisor saying to me that, everything I would submit to her, she'd say, "Oh, but this reads like a short story," and I'd say, "No, no, no, but this is the first chapter of my novel." And then she said, and her thesis was that the energy on a sentence level, the energy of a short, in a sentence in a short story is different from a sentence in a novel. And that's like, I don't know that I agree with it, but that idea stuck with me a lot. And whether it's like a couple of sentences maybe in a short story, you have that sense of foreclosure that's kind of coming so soon, and you don't have that in a novel. I don't know if that's true, but I was really struggling to kind of break through that. And what I started doing was I started kind of trying to trick myself into thinking of the novel as multiple novellas kind of stitched together. So that's why I read like Death in Venice, which is 25,000 words. I kind of read and reread and reread and reread. And I was like, okay, how much story can he fit into 25,000 words? And think of the first section of your novel as like a novella, as a long short story, as a novella, and see what you can fit in. And so that was this kind of way of kind of fooling myself, or of kind of keeping writing short stories, but writing something larger.
I love that. I do think that is an interesting. I mean, I've never really successfully written short stories, so I haven't written a short story in literal years. But I mean, that is interesting to think about the function of a sentence in each, and that there is this kind of time constraint in a short story that doesn't necessarily, I mean, obviously there are constraints in a novel, but I think that you're right. I mean, I think that's interesting just from a style perspective. Well, this has been such a gorgeous conversation. I know you're in London and this is, you know, 1:00,000 in the morning. So I think I shall let you go, get some sleep.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this wonderful, I mean, like, I cannot imagine anything more joyful than spending this time talking to you about my book. I mean, we should really have talked a bit more about your book, which is so glorious, so wonderful.
It was all about you, honey. But yeah, wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you both for joining us. If for people who will watch this very soon and in just a few minutes, if you have not already gotten a copy of this lovely book, you can grab one from Skylight Books. We have plenty for you. And if you are not local, you can grab one at skylightbooks.com by clicking the big shiny green button at the bottom of your screen that says Order Other Names for Love here. Thank you again to Taymour Soomro and Jonathan Parks-Ramage for joining us, and we hope to see you all soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Skylight Books podcast series. Please don't forget to visit our website at skylightbooks.com and make sure to follow us on Twitter and Instagram. Also, don't forget to subscribe to this podcast for more author talks and bookseller conversations. You can find us on Podbean, iTunes, and Spotify. Stay safe and healthy, and we hope to see you back in our store soon.